On this channel, I reviewed all 33 PETA games, and I regretted every moment of it. These games vary in quality and almost none of them are good. These games are full of pretentious dialogue where PETA forces its message down your throat and not a lot of good gameplay. I'm going to rank every single one of these games based on how much I enjoyed them on my first playthrough and how much I think I would enjoy it on my second playthrough. I wasn't able to play some of these games because they're no longer available, but I think I have a pretty good idea where they would stack up. I'm gonna start with the best PETA games and work my way all the way down to the worst. The tiers are as follows: good, fine, it's a game. Then there's it's hardly even a game / just not enough information on the game. There's then bad, painful, and the worst tier, burn it with fire. So I'm not gonna rank each of these games within their own tiers. So once I get in a tier, I'll be talking about these games in no particular order. And before we begin, I want to mention that I am never gonna play any of these games just for fun. And that's not just because it's PETA. Genuinely, none of these games are that fun to warrant me playing them in my free time. And just for the sake of time, I'm not going to give a full breakdown on all of these games. For the most part, I'm just going to give a quick recap and show a little bit of footage. But for the most part, I'm going to assume that you've seen my other videos and have a decent knowledge on most of these games. If you haven't seen my other videos, I'll link the playlist with all of these videos down in the description, so if you want to watch those videos and come back to this one, feel free. Let's begin with the only game I put in the good tier. Meat is Murder the Game. Yeah, it's a fun enough mobile game. All you need to do is tap to make sure no animals go into the saw blades, but you have to be careful you don't miss any or tap on a bomb. Yeah, it's fast paced and entertaining enough, but I really can't see myself playing this ever again. But this is as good as it gets for a PETA game. Now we enter the fine tier. I didn't really have a fun time playing any of these games, but all of these games do show some positive attributes. Real quick, I do want to give a disclaimer. All games from this point on would most likely be in a bad tier if I was comparing any of these games to real games. But since we're just comparing these to other PETA games, these all go in a fine tier. Let's start with Butcher Goes Vegan. This game is essentially vertical Flappy Bird. I mean, this game looks just as fine as Flappy Bird does, but with that being said, it's not 2014 and I'm not a huge fan of Flappy Bird. I'm not gonna have much to say on some of these, by the way. Lobster Liberation is literally just Frogger but lobster. And again, I don't really love Frogger, and this feels like a more unfair version of it anyway. Breast Not Animal Tests. All it is a fast-paced matching game. As it goes on, it gets faster and faster and harder, making you maybe want to play it again for a high score. The gameplay looks simple yet somewhat satisfying, but this is one of the games that I couldn't play for myself, and I couldn't find a reason to really put it any higher or lower than this. Mario Kills Tanuki in general is just a bad endless runner. I would never play this game while any other endless runner that I've played before still exists. But in the magical world of PETA, it's a fine game. I want to end off the fine tier with what I believe to be one of the most played PETA games from my audience, Kitten Squad. It's probably been played by so many people since it's on the Switch and the PS4, and a lot of people commented on my videos saying that they liked the game and didn't even know it was made by PETA until they watched my video, which I just find hilarious. Okay, so here's the thing with Kitten Squad. The first run you have with Kitten Squad is genuinely fine. It's still not super fun and it does look terrible, but it's honestly okay. The problem comes when you start a second run and realize it's the exact same as before. This game just lacks variety and the base game itself isn't really that fun to begin with. As long as I don't have to play this game for very long, I'll say it's fine. But if you force me to play through every single mission in the game, I would have to drop this game far down the list. Let's move on to the it's a game tier. This tier is where I really don't have any strong feelings towards the games. It just kind of leaves a neutral taste in my mouth. Monkey Fright. Yeah, this game is bad and looks terrible, but the pros are the fact that it's really short. I played this game a couple times for a video and never did I have a terrible time, but never did I enjoy my time at all. If we were ranking on visuals alone, it would be the worst. Plus, the controls are very floaty, but at the end of the day, it's not hard and very short, which I think is what really gives this game a pass. Seal's Hero is one of the games we have very little info on. All we have is this recording of the first 3 levels on an old iPod. From the looks of it, it looks like it might be kind of mundane, but I can genuinely see some potential for there to be some interesting strategy in the game. But I can't imagine this game is very deep. Seal Slalom is a game where you try to go down a hill as fast as possible. All you have to do is avoid the obstacles, and this is definitely a game. Turkey Lurkey, master of the skies. So to my knowledge, no gameplay of this game exists online. But from looking at the picture, it looks like this is a slide puzzle, and last time I checked, slide puzzles are definitely games. Elephants Never Forget is a memory game, and last time I checked, memory games are also games. Now it's time for a hardly even a game / not a lot of information on the game. Let's first take a look at Vegan Calculator. Vegan Calculator shows you how many animals you'd save if you went vegan. Assuming that all the information is accurate, I think this is actually kind of cool, but definitely dated and not really a game. The Minecraft server falls in between not a game and not enough information. By the looks of it, all you do is look around and admire the craftsmanship, I guess. Or maybe you'll get inspired to go vegan, as that was their main goal of the server. This server does look like they put a lot of work into it, but since the servers are no longer up and there's not a lot of videos on it online, I can't really properly place this on the list anywhere. The last game in this tier is Paintball Hero. It's a mobile game that was made by a 17-year-old student. The only gameplay that I could find is this preview uploaded from the student himself. So again, there's just no way for me to properly rank this. Now it's time for the bad tier. Basically, I didn't really have any fun playing these games, but it wasn't so painful to sit through. Cooking Mama, Mama Kills Animals. It's a cheap parody of Cooking Mama, and it plays exactly like you would expect. I played the real Cooking Mama on stream for the first time recently, and it wasn't as good of a game as I was hoping for. And I hate to say it, but it made me realize as far as the actual gameplay goes in the PETA version, it's really not too much worse than the real deal. I did play the Switch one, which is infamous for having its own problems, but that's all I have to go off, and I really did think I would be ranking this game a lot lower than I did, but I'm just trying to be honest here. Fast Food Nation the game is a parody of Burger Time, and obviously it's not a good parody either. But really, at the end of the day, all it is a less polished, unfair version of Burger Time. I loved Burger Time and hated playing Fast Food Nation, but let's be real, it could have been way worse. Chicken Commando is one of the games that I was not able to play, but all you need to do is click on the chicken before it gets into the cart. I could only find one video of this game online, and the guy who was playing it said the game was very unresponsive, so I'm just gonna take his word on it and put it in the bad tier. Revenge of the PETA Tomatoes may be one of the stupidest looking PETA games, but since all you do is point and click, it isn't too bad to sit through at all. With that being said, it isn't even good at hitting what I clicked on. PETA's Sexy Striptease is literally just a quiz that has a girl getting more and more naked the further you get into it. Assuming the information is accurate, there's nothing wrong with the game, but at the end of the day, quizzes don't make for very entertaining games. Unless it's something like the Impossible quiz. And I mean, having the girl strip for me does nothing for me, as if I'm horny, I can just look up porn anytime. I don't need to sit through this quiz. Create Your Own Sea Kitten is a dress-up game. In my opinion, dress-up games hardly even qualify as games, but I would say they technically count, and I mean, it's fine, I guess? It plays like any other dress-up game, but at the end of the day, I guess dress-up games just aren't my cup of tea. J-Lo Monster in Fur and Bloody Burberry are essentially the same game. They're both just stupid and mindless. They're so easy, all you have to do is walk into certain stuff while avoiding the enemies. Bloody Burberry is a little worse given the ridiculous cutscenes and random hate against innocent people, but they're really just two bad and mindless games. That's all for the bad tier, now let's move on to the painful tier. Super Tofu Boy, the Super Meat Boy parody, is such an unresponsive game with poor controls. I physically hated some of these levels. Specifically the auto-scroll ones, those were the worst. But the rest of the levels aren't too painful if you're not going for the band-aids. If this tier list involved having me 100% these games, this game would be much lower. But since I don't have to collect all of the bandages, it will sit comfortably in the terrible tier. I'm going to lump both of the Super Chick Sisters together because they're essentially the same game. If you watched my Super Chick Sisters video, you may be surprised that they're this low. In that video, I actually gave these games a little bit of credit. While I don't disagree with anything I said in that video, I think I have good reason for putting this in the terrible tier. First of all, like I said, they're essentially both the same game, and that just makes the experience twice as long, which is even worse given the fact that these games are on the longer side of all the PETA games. I could beat Super Tofu Boy at least like 3 times before beating one of these games, assuming I'm watching all of the cutscenes and taking my time. But I guess you can beat these two games in less than an hour, but it's still 40 minutes of just dull platforming. Replaying this game just sounds so freaking boring. Not to mention the mostly tone-deaf writing and the fact that this is the only game with an unskippable animal abuse video. Yeah, there's actually funny moments in a couple of the cutscenes and some gimmicks that can be fun for a second, but the negatives heavily outweigh the pros. Harry Kate and Trashily is just another dress-up game, but this one is just grosser and more graphic than the other one we talked about, knocking it down a tier. In Make Fred Spew, you just drag dairy products to his mouth and he throws up. This is hardly a game, but I guess it counts? The only thing going for the game is the fact that you can beat it in literal seconds, but this game is just so freaking stupid. Now let's move on to the worst tier, Burn It With Fire. So far I haven't been ranking any of these games within their own tier, but for this final tier I want to start doing that. So in other words, here's the list of the 6 worst PETA games. Number 6, Cage Fight. So this is a River City Ransom parody with some of the laziest dialogue ever. I already am not a huge fan of beat 'em ups, but this is the worst one I've played by far. I had trouble even lining myself up with any enemy to hit them consistently. I'm willing to accept the fact that this is partially a skill issue on my part and then I gave up a bit too quickly, but I think the fact that I gave up as quickly as I did speaks for itself. And even if I was a master at this game is so dull and doesn't really evolve in any way past the first level. Not to mention that the story doesn't even try to make sense. Number 5, KKK or AKC. So in my last video, I tried to look up controversies for the AKC and didn't really see a ton. But you guys mentioned to me how problematic that the AKC actually can be. I do apologize for not properly conveying that information in my last video. Like I said, I did try to Google it, but either Google just failed me on the results or I just didn't look into it as much as I should. But with that being said, this is still an insane comparison. In the striptease quiz, there's even a question that shows how insecure PETA is about the fact that no one truly understands why they compared these two groups to begin with. So this game is really just a quiz, which is already boring, but it's built on such a ridiculous premise, I think it belongs at the bottom. Number 4 and number 3 are the 2 Pokemon games. These are essentially the same game, and honestly, it's a bit hard to even call these games. There is no strategy or evolution of gameplay in literally any sense. You just click through the dialogue and click on these boxes to attack once you enter a battle. Once you've beaten your first battle, you may as well have beaten them all. Most of this game is really just cutscenes. The writing in this game is so bad. They shove their message down your throat constantly while trying to sprinkle in humor that always falls flat and just makes it all so cringy to read. And it's so apparent that the people who play this game never have seen or played Pokemon once in their life, and it drives me insane. Like the 2 Chick Sisters games, both of these games are essentially the same game, which just means I have to sit through the same game twice. And throughout this game, PETA constantly rags on Nintendo for making all Pokemon games essentially the same game, despite the fact that is exactly what PETA is doing. The second worst PETA game of all time is Pirates of the Carib Bean. This game is just a choose your own adventure. Imagine the cutscenes in the Pokemon games, but crank the cringy jokes up to 10 and add a touch of racism. This game doesn't even give you the illusion of fun like the Pokemon battles may give you if you don't realize there's no strategy involved. It's nothing but an awful story with bad joke after bad joke. Parts of this game are funny for the wrong reasons. For example, the main characters just let some chicks get boiled alive and eaten when they easily could have done something about it. This game is just pure insanity and stupidity at every single turn. In most other PETA games, I can at least see what they're going for, but all the contradictions and other problems are way more obvious than ever. I cannot imagine how anyone approved this game, even in an ironic way. You don't approve a racist game in an ironic way. That's just not how it works. There is no way they didn't know what they were doing here. The worst PETA game of all time is Save Sammy the Seal. This is a parody of the old school maze game, but instead of seeing a creepy dead girl from a movie, you see a real dead graphic seal carcass. It is the most graphic thing that they have shown in any PETA game, and a lot of these games link you to multiple videos of animal abuse. So that's saying something. This game isn't available to play anymore, but it looks pretty damn hard to beat this game without seeing the gross seal multiple times. games. I think this is the worst game because it's so disgusting, I would refuse to ever play it. I would play all the rest of these PETA games again if I had to for a YouTube video or something like that, but you literally could not pay me to play Sammy the Seal ever. And because of that, I think it makes it very fair for me to put this as the worst PETA game of all time. I hope you enjoyed my rankings. Let me know what you agreed on and what you disagreed on in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, because I am not done making fun of PETA. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a fantastic Tuesday.